I never thought something so small could shift everything. A click? Barely audible, but too out of place for a midday silence. I was standing by the stairs, about to go down with the laundry, when I caught that sound. The house was quiet. My husband at work, me at home, and him. He was upstairs. I slowly went back up. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, almost like they were warning me, don't. But I was already on my way. The noise could have been anything. Headphones, a video, maybe a phone call. I tried to reason with myself. I just wanted to check. Maybe he was bored. I thought, I'll offer coffee. Or a few words, just to ease the air between us. We barely spoke lately anyway. But the closer I got, the tighter it clenched inside me. The door was ajar. Not wide open, just enough to catch the flicker of the screen. The glow from the monitor spilled across his face. Focused. Intense. He hadn't noticed me. I stood there, right on the edge of knocking or walking away. But I did neither. I just stood. A second. Just a moment. That was enough. I stepped back so fast the laundry slipped from my arms. One step, then another. My heart pounded, my palms cold. I went back downstairs and sat on the edge of the couch like my legs couldn't carry me. One thought looped in my mind. Why did I look? But it wasn't about what I saw. It was about what I felt. A wave of shame washed over me. Not for him, but for myself. There was nothing inappropriate about accidentally glancing into a room. But why hadn't I looked away instantly? Why did I linger for even a second? I tried to convince myself it was just awkwardness, but the truth was different. In that moment, right there in the hallway, I realized I wasn't just a housemate. I was a woman. Lonely. Left alone in the house, in the marriage, in my own life. We didn't speak that day. Not even a greeting. At dinner, no eye contact. Just the quiet clinking of a fork on the plate. I didn't know if he saw me at the door. Maybe he had. Or maybe he pretended not to. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and caught myself listening. Was he awake yet? That became a new ritual. Noticing what I hadn't noticed before. How he walked down the hall. How he brushed his hair. How his gaze dropped whenever I entered the kitchen. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't romance. Not even flirtation. It was a kind of unspoken tension, like something cracked in the air, and neither of us knew what to do with it. I felt a part of me, long frozen, start to stir. And that was terrifying. I didn't want change, but I already knew. Whatever happened had started something. Later, I kept wondering what exactly was the trigger. Maybe it wasn't the sound, or the screen, or his face. Maybe it was the fact that I stayed, that I didn't look away. Because if everything was fine, with me, with my marriage, with life, I would have turned around immediately. That meant something was already broken. And what I saw in his room just lit that crack, like a beam slicing through the dark. Sharp, uncomfortable, but real. I didn't know how to live with it now. But I knew one thing for sure. What happened in that second on the stairs couldn't be erased. And it couldn't be undone. I tried to act normal, wash the dishes, water the plants, answer work emails. But every time I passed by his room, I could feel the tension hanging in the air. We didn't talk about it. Not a word. Not a gesture. Everything seemed calm on the surface, but inside me it boiled. And not because I had done something wrong, but because I hadn't done anything. And yet the thoughts wouldn't let me go. He started behaving differently. Not in any obvious way. He didn't move closer, didn't stare. But something in him had changed. Maybe he was being cautious, maybe just more aware. I could sense it in the way he quietly walked past, how he closed his door the next day when it used to stay ajar. Almost like he was drawing a line between us. Or maybe hiding something that wasn't meant to be seen again. I kept trying to justify myself, reminding myself he wasn't a child, that I was 47 and he was 23, that we just lived in the same house, that I was a married woman, and that what had happened was just a moment. a slip of attention. But each day, the thoughts became clearer. I remembered how he looked at the screen, how his hands moved, how the light lit up his face. And it unsettled me, not because I saw it, but because I kept remembering it. My husband, as usual, was lost in his own world. He didn't notice that I stayed up past midnight or wandered around the house with the radio on. We'd been living in separate orbits for a long time. He only talked about work, the news, the weather. I talked about bills and groceries. Everything else? Silence. Sometimes I wondered if he even noticed how much I had changed. No look, no question, no effort to come close. And maybe that was the real danger. I started to feel invisible. And that made everything in this house feel sharper, more alive. I remembered how, in my youth, everything felt intense, sudden, on the edge. And now, I was fading like a weak lamp. No passion, no urgency, no pulse. Then suddenly, one spike, like an electric jolt, not to the body, to the mind. And even though I did everything to mute it, it came back. I started asking myself questions. Why did I feel guilty? Had I broken a rule? So what was it that haunted me? The answer was simple. I wasn't indifferent anymore. And that was already dangerous, because indifference was the only thing holding the structure together. Without it, everything started to shake. I wasn't planning to change anything. Not myself, not my family. But I already knew. Something had changed. Inside. A tiny shift. But those are the ones that trigger a chain reaction. I tried to shut my eyes, to live like before. But reality no longer played along. Every day I made micro choices. Look him in the eye or avoid him. Smile or stay silent. And each time it took effort. A subtle strain that didn't show but hurt all the same. He stayed quiet, and so did I. But our silences were different. Mine came from fear. His, from uncertainty. I could feel it. At some point, I realized I'd started listening to the silence, tuning into it like a frequency. I could sense his presence without seeing him. And that scared me more than anything. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt too alive. And everything that's alive carries consequences. It happened when I least expected it. Just another evening, dull like all the ones before it. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through old recipes, trying to keep myself distracted. At some point, I heard him walk in. I felt it before I even saw him. The air changed, thicker, heavier. He sat down next to me. Not too close, but not like before either. The distance between us was gone. I knew this could be a trap. Not because of him, but because of me. The TV flickered in the background. We were watching some movie, but neither of us was paying attention. All my energy was focused on not shaking, on staying composed. I tried to breathe evenly, but then he shifted closer, just to reach for a blanket. I reached out at the same time. Our hands touched. And in that moment, time seemed to tear open. Neither of us pulled away. No awkward joke, no glance away. Everything stopped, and in that stillness, I realized I didn't want him to move away. I was afraid he would. He looked straight at me. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I dropped my gaze, but I didn't move back. He leaned in slightly. I could have stopped it. I could have stood up. I could have said no. But I didn't. His lips touched mine. A short kiss. Almost innocent. Almost. But everything that had held us apart fell in that moment. I jumped up like I'd been burned and rushed out of the room. My chest was pounding like someone was knocking from the inside. I made it to the bathroom, turned on the cold water, and pressed my hands to my face. I wasn't crying, but I couldn't breathe. That wasn't just a kiss. That was a confession. No words, no reasoning. And the worst part, I kissed him back. Not physically, emotionally. I let it happen, and now it was inside me. I stared into the mirror, not recognizing my reflection. Not because it was unfamiliar, because it was too real. For the first time in years, I felt like a woman. Not someone's wife, not a housekeeper, not a function, a woman. And that feeling was dangerous because it made me feel free. I knew the line had been crossed. Not with my body, with my mind. There was no going back to how things were. Everything between us now carried that moment on the couch. Even if we never mentioned it again, it happened. And I wasn't the same. I went to bed, but I couldn't close my eyes. I kept replaying every detail. How he looked at me, how he froze, how gently he leaned in. It wasn't boldness. It was a question. And maybe that's what struck me. He didn't take. He offered. And I accepted. And that was my fault. Not because I'm unfaithful, but because I betrayed my indifference. I unlocked something I had kept buried for so long. I let life in. And now, I had to live with it. I thought I could survive the silence. That we'd both just forget, stay quiet, bury it like it never happened. But the morning was too bright. I walked into the kitchen and saw him standing by the window with a cup of coffee. He turned, nodded. I gave the same empty nod in return. Everything looked normal. Too normal. And that's what made it all so wrong. I avoided eye contact, tried to fill the space with motion, opening the window, wiping the table, reaching for the bread. But every step he took across the floor felt like more than a step. It was a challenge. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was awareness. We were both trying so hard to act right. And that's what made everything feel so wrong. I didn't notice the doorbell at first. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. Lately, I kept drifting inside my own mind, and the real sound felt like a hand yanking me back out. At the door stood his grandfather, a small travel bag in hand, the one that always carried candy, a first aid kit, and a neatly folded stack of newspapers. He didn't visit often, but when he did, it was never without reason. He didn't linger without purpose. I tried to summon joy to greet him, but something inside me tightened, like someone had pulled the curtains back when I wasn't dressed. He hugged his grandson, then looked at me, calmly, almost warmly, but too closely. I felt that extra second his eyes lingered, and that was enough to knock the breath out of me. Over tea, he told stories from his youth, the ones we'd already heard dozens of times. I smiled at the right moments, nodded, chimed in to keep the flow going. But inside, all of me was focused on how he looked at us, not individually, but as an us, as if he could sense something. And maybe he could. People who've lived through war, loneliness, and old age tend to see what others don't. Before leaving, he pulled a box out of his bag. I didn't even realize what it was at first. A new suit. For graduation. For his grandson. He said he'd ordered it days ago, that these moments matter. You don't miss them. I nodded, thanked him. But the voice that came out wasn't really mine. It had stayed behind. Somewhere near the stairs, at the door I never fully closed. I watched him drive away and suddenly felt the weight on my back. I hadn't done anything wrong. But his presence, his eyes, made me feel like I already had. I was embarrassed, not because of him, but because of how easily I had let this feeling take root. How quickly I'd allowed myself to redraw the lines I'd lived by for so long. That was the real shift. Not because he might have guessed, but because I saw it myself. Now I wasn't just afraid of my thoughts or actions. I was afraid someone else might see them. And if the fear of being seen is stronger than the guilt itself, then guilt is already living inside you. The door slammed so hard I nearly dropped my cup. It was past midnight. I had gone to bed long ago, but I hadn't slept. Lately, sleep had turned into a kind of waiting, anxious without reason. Or maybe with a reason, just no words. I stepped into the hallway barefoot, wearing only a tank top and whatever I'd grabbed in a hurry. I didn't turn on the lights, just darkness and soft noises. He was back. And from the way his footsteps sounded, I already knew something was wrong. Drunk? Lost? Deep down, it felt like he hadn't just come home. He'd come to someone. To me. I found him in the kitchen. He was sitting there, staring at the table like he was trying to remember why he came. His hair was a mess, his eyes glassy, his face somehow unfamiliar, yet painfully familiar at the same time. I wanted to say something sharp, ask where he'd been, but I held it in, because I realized he wasn't the one crossing boundaries right now. I was the one standing too close. I put the kettle on. The sound of the water boiling broke the tension a bit, but the room was still too full, not of people, of thoughts. I placed a mug in front of him. He picked it up, but his hands shook. Some of the tea spilled onto the table. He didn't apologize, didn't explain, just sat there, as if his very presence was the apology. I began wiping up the drops. And that's when he looked up at me. Not like before, not reserved. It was an open, raw look, like a tired child just wanting to be understood. And I was scared. Not for him, for myself. We didn't speak, but everything between us spoke. Our posture, our silence, the way the air shifted. I felt myself tighten inside. I wanted him to go to bed. I almost said it, but didn't. He stood up on his own, unsteady. I stood beside him, almost without thinking. I led him down the hall. Something inside me cracked, but my legs carried me forward. When we stepped into his room, I realized how far gone he was. He fumbled at the buttons of his shirt, unfocused. I stood by the door, fingers clenched. Then I walked over, gently reached for his collar, helped him like I used to help my son with his coat when he was little. But this wasn't that. He didn't look me in the eye, but his breath was near mine, and in that closeness, nothing was innocent anymore. It wasn't a kiss, not even a touch. But everything happening was already a violation. I knew it, clearly, but I didn't pull away. I finished helping him, turned, and walked out. When I shut my bedroom door, I cried for the first time in weeks. Not out of guilt, out of helplessness. I knew there was no going back. Something in me had cracked, not with drama, not all at once. Like a line in glass, you can't see it breaking, but it's no longer whole. I lay there, staring at the ceiling until the dark swallowed my thoughts. And all I could feel was how quietly, almost invisibly, one of us had taken yet another step toward a place where everything would either collapse or be revealed. For a long time, I couldn't look him in the eyes. The house seemed unchanged. The same dishes, the same sounds, even the smell of morning coffee was the same. But it was an illusion. Everything had shifted. Not suddenly, not in any clear moment, but in the air between us. We stopped bumping into each other, too careful in the hallway, too precise in sensing the other's presence, making sure not to get too close. That was our way of covering up the aftermath. But it didn't disappear. It just lived beside us, like a shadow. One afternoon, he walked into the kitchen just as I was about to leave, and I realized I was tired of being afraid. Not because there was nothing to fear, but because fear solved nothing. I stayed, turned to grab a spoon from the table. And there he was. Our eyes met. No time to think. No words, just silence. And in it, an understanding. He stepped forward. I didn't move back. My hand was still holding the spoon like an anchor. But he took it from me. And that's when I let go. Not of the spoon, of myself. He kissed me. Not like before. This time, on purpose. Softly, slowly, steady. There was no rush in it, but there was a line. A line you can't describe but can definitely feel. And in that moment, it vanished. I kissed him back. Not immediately. It was as if I was waiting for proof that this was really happening. And once I had it, I no longer resisted. My fingers found his hand. My lips no longer trembled. Everything about it was wrong, but it felt calm. Afterward, we simply walked away. No words, as if nothing had happened. But inside, everything had. I could feel something in me shift. The internal battle was gone. Only silence remained. But not the kind that scares you. It was full. Complete. That evening, I realized for the first time, it wasn't that I'd crossed someone else's boundaries. It was that I'd stopped guarding my own. I allowed something I used to fear even imagining. Not because I didn't understand where it might lead, but because holding back no longer made sense. I stood by the window for a long time. The street was quiet, just like I was. No anxiety, no panic. Just a dull, uncomfortable truth. I had started playing a game I wouldn't be able to control. And even if I stopped, I wouldn't leave it the same person I was before. I wanted to go back to the version of me who walked down the stairs with laundry that first day. The one who heard a click and had no idea how everything would change. But she was gone. Only I remained. This new version of me. And with each day, I found it harder to understand who that woman even was. He woke me up with his laughter. Not forced, not awkward. Light, genuine, as if that night, that kiss had never happened. I lay in bed, listening. He was on the phone, laughing, moving through the kitchen with the kind of ease he used to have before any of this. And I lay in silence. A silence louder than anything I'd heard in days. Something clenched inside me. Not jealousy. Something closer to being lost, watching someone else find themselves. I walked downstairs barefoot, wearing only a robe, telling myself I just needed water. He had his back to me in the kitchen, but turned when he heard my steps. Our eyes met, and neither of us smiled. The cheer on his face from seconds ago disappeared. Only the look remained. Focused, adult, aware. I poured the water, pretending I was in a rush to get back upstairs, but my feet moved slowly. I could feel it. He was waiting for something. Maybe an explanation. Maybe a silent cue that we both knew what this was now. But I gave him neither. We started living like we were on different floors. Technically close, but not in the same world. Every dinner, stiffly polite. Every glance, measured. It seemed like we were back to the beginning. Only this time, the silence wasn't a shield. It was a sentence. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about the way he moved, how he placed a cup, how he dried his hands with a towel. I knew his gestures like my own, and that terrified me. Because knowing someone this intimately, that too was a kind of closeness. And closeness, in our case, meant betrayal had become part of the daily routine. One day, I heard him laugh again. Outside this time, talking to someone by the gate. And it sounded different. Not like it did in the house. Out there, it was alive. In here, it was always restrained. Like we now shared two separate worlds. One, outward, one he could still escape to. The other, ours, where every step was heavy with implication. That night we were alone. My husband had gone to visit friends, and the house somehow felt even quieter. I was cleaning the kitchen. He was watching TV in the living room. At some point, I felt him behind me, just standing, not touching, not speaking, but close enough for me to feel his breath. And without turning around, I knew. He was waiting for me to speak. But I didn't. Not because there was nothing to say, but because any word might break the balance. Because now, every gesture came with consequence. Every yes felt like permission. Every no, like a lie. I wasn't afraid of his reaction. I was afraid of mine. And in that silence, I realized, if fear has become a habit, then we've already gone too far. I wasn't looking for anything when I walked into his room. It was afternoon. The house was quiet. He had gone out for a walk. He did that often lately. I didn't plan to enter. I only meant to leave a clean towel on the dresser. But the door was open. The sunlight was warm, and something about the stillness of the room pulled me in. It smelled like him. Laundry, deodorant, a trace of something sharp, like pencil shavings. Familiar. Too familiar. I placed the towel down and turned to leave. Then I saw the box. It was tucked under his desk, just barely visible. A plain cardboard box with a corner torn. I don't know what made me pull it out. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I wanted to feel something again. Anything other than this aching fog I'd been living in. The tape wasn't even sealed. It gave way with one soft tug. Inside, old papers, notebooks, loose sheets folded in half. I recognized the childish handwriting before I read the words. Drawings of trees, stick figures, messy letters forming lopsided sentences. Some of them addressed to no one, others to Mom, though I knew they weren't meant for me. A few were stories, half-finished, dreamlike, heavy with metaphors no child should have needed. But what caught my breath was the one with my name on it. Not Mom, my name. Written carefully like it mattered. Like he had rewritten it several times to get it right. The letter wasn't long. He had written it years ago. I could tell by the penmanship, by the way the sentences wavered between honest and terrified. He thanked me for listening, for noticing him when no one else did, for making the house feel less sharp, less hollow. He said he knew I didn't owe him anything, but he hoped I would never stop looking at him like he mattered. I sat down on the edge of his bed with the letter in my hands and couldn't stop the tears. Not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet rivers down my face, like something inside me finally gave up resisting. It wasn't love I felt. It was weight. The weight of being seen. All this time I thought I was the one slipping, that I was the one losing control, failing at boundaries. But reading those words, I realized this had been growing quietly for years. Not out of lust, out of longing, out of recognition. I wasn't his mistake. I was his constant, and that terrified me more than anything. That night, the phone rang. It was his grandfather. Just checking in. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes, of course. My voice was even, practiced. But I could feel him listening on the other end, really listening, as if he could hear everything I wasn't saying. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. The letter was still in my hands. I hadn't returned it to the box. I didn't know if I ever could, because a part of me had been waiting for someone to see me too. And somehow, he had. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew this. What we were now could no longer hide under silence or distance. The truth had taken shape. And the only question left was, what would we do with it? He found it by accident. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe it was one of those moments where the truth gets tired of waiting and just pushes through. I'd left a bracelet on the edge of the bathroom sink. Simple, nothing remarkable. But it wasn't mine. It had been in his room. And now it was out in the open. My husband walked past me, holding it in his hand, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask, didn't accuse. Just placed it on the hallway table and kept walking. But everything about the way he did it said, I know. My breath caught. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because there was none. No argument, no demand. Just silence. Thick, final, and loaded. And somehow that was worse. I stood there, unable to move, while the floor beneath me seemed to tilt ever so slightly. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a mirror I had stopped recognizing. I moved through it on autopilot, making dinner, folding laundry, wiping down surfaces, trying to pretend that reality hadn't already shifted. But every object, every wall, knew. There's no pretending in a house that has already seen too much. That evening, I sat by the window while the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows that reached all the way to my feet. I could hear footsteps upstairs. Light ones. Familiar. He was in his room. I imagined him reading, or maybe just staring at the ceiling like I sometimes did, wondering how he got here. I didn't go to him. For the first time in weeks, I didn't move toward the pole. I stayed where I was, letting the silence settle around me like a second skin. Because the truth wasn't just that I had crossed a line. It was that I had chosen to. Repeatedly. Quietly. Even when I told myself I was only reacting, not deciding. That had been a lie, too. I thought about leaving, about packing a bag and disappearing into a hotel for a few days. But running wasn't a solution. It would only stretch the silence thinner. The damage had already been done. And the hardest part? I didn't even know if I regretted it. There's a difference between guilt and clarity. I didn't feel like a villain. I didn't feel like a victim either. What I felt was something more complicated, something that lives in the space between right and wrong. I had tried to find warmth in a place that should have never held it. And in doing so, I had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. The front door closed quietly. My husband had left. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't follow. I just stood in the kitchen, holding on to the back of a chair like it could anchor me. In the distance, I heard a floorboard creak. Then, silence again. He didn't come down. I didn't go up. We stayed in our separate corners, each of us holding a part of something unspoken. And in that quiet, I finally accepted it. We weren't the same people who started this story. And there was no neat ending waiting on the other side. No confession. No dramatic outburst. Just a hallway, a bracelet, and the quiet certainty that some things, once broken, never return to what they were. But maybe in that space between ruin and rebuilding, we get to decide who we really are.